up, guys? Shawnthebro here. Today we're going to be finishing up the local multiplayer section of the fighting game tutorial. I did also make a few changes to the camera. Don't worry, they will be in the next episode, in the camera episode part 2. I just got a head start because I had some extra time. So don't worry about the camera changes. They're not even finished yet, but I just wanted to make that aware before we get started. Okay, so in today's episode, we will be going over creating another player controller. That way we can actually control 2 players. And if I didn't hit the wrong button, we can actually control 2 different players with one device. This is with the keyboard, or with 2 devices, like 2 controllers. So the one device thing makes it a bit challenging because it is more complicated than just having 2 different input devices that are actually giving you values. But we're going to go over it in a way that should make sense for both controllers. So let's get out of this and start with the code. And if you haven't watched the first part of this tutorial, you'll want to watch part 1 of the local multiplayer. I'll link in the icon in the top right. That'll get you to kind of where we are now, but fixing the movement for player 2 on one input device, and then also creating a player controller so we can use 2 devices. So there's actually no new variables that I've made this time. You can see everything's the same if you've been following the series. But basically, I did add a boolean called isDevice for multiple players, and it's kind of a loaded name. We're not going to be using it today. In fact, I might not have to use it at all during the tutorial, but I do want to point this out because this is a good way you can actually separate or differentiate between playing on a keyboard or an arcade stick that has 2 players on one input device and playing on controller. You could use this because that might determine what controls they can actually set, or it can also change like the way your widgets have to look for input, because all that stuff has to be taken into account, right? So again, not using this today, but think about potentially issues that could come up with one input device versus 2, and you might want a boolean to just determine that. Okay, now to get into the actual stuff we're going to do. So didn't change anything with the constructor, but did organize all my variables to be in the same order. So if you see any changes there, don't worry. I mentioned this last time, but this is probably the most important part about today's episode. So what we're doing here is we're going to rebind controls for player 1 and player 2. This will help us deal with controls for 2 different input devices. So this won't matter for one input device. Although I'd still recommend doing this regardless in case you want to add that functionality down the road. So basically, if you're new to the series or you just want a reminder, set up player input component is where you can set all your controls. So you can set controls for basically anything that you have, any of the different players you have, where you want them to perform different functionality. And what I mean by that is if you have a child class, you can call separate functions in here by doing the same attack. In this case, since we're using our base fighter class, it's our fighter template character, we actually want to separate player 1 and player 2 inputs. This way we can determine which player is doing what. So the issue with this is that if they're both using the same input device, like two different input devices but the same thing, so 2 Xbox controllers, well, you don't necessarily want to make these different input device or different controls to press, right? Like A should still do this attack, or A should still jump, or whatever. So what you can do here, I'm going to show you in the editor, is add all the different possibilities that you want them to account for. Okay, so if you go to Edit Project Settings in the editor and go to Input, we've done this a lot, so you've been watching the series. Now, again, I've shown you this in the last episode, but just make sure you have all this down. So you have P1 and P2 now. You could do it all under one, but if you do it all under one and don't separate them from P1 and P2, just make sure that they have to use a certain input device or that their controls are localized between the devices. Otherwise, there will be players that won't be able to actually trigger certain things unless you do your own controller binding system, which is true and actually something that we'll probably get into in this episode, or excuse me, not in this episode, in this series. However, for now, just go ahead and make P1 and P2 and make sure that they're either different or they had the ability to be different, but then you can add more and make them the same. Okay, so P1 should be different from attack 4, P2, and things like that. And then make sure for the axis mappings, you do have move right P2 like you have move right P1. You see I have the same here, like I'm talking about. So you can have the same, because on 2 different input devices, it'll just pick up the correct player that is being possessed. But for the keyboard, make sure you have different values. That way 2 players can be on 1 input device. I think that makes sense. Okay. So just make sure you have everything set up here where you can access both characters. And then you can copy all your P1 logic or all the logic you already had in your setup player input component and just copy it but change everything to P2. Call different functions if necessary, but you shouldn't have to. And then I also did this thing at the start here, so let me explain what's going on here. Again, if you're familiar with the series, you'll know we have this thing where we check for player 1 and player 2 in the game mode, and player 1 has other player and player 2 has other player, meaning you always have a reference to your opponent, and the game mode has a reference to both players. So what we can use that for here is if in our setup player input component, we get the game mode. So auto game mode is equal to the casted game mode that we have, and this is how you get the game mode in Unreal by default. These are not functions I made, these are Unreal functions. Get world, get auth game mode, which I think is like authority game mode, I believe. I don't know. Not really sure what that auth means, to be honest, but get auth game mode. So anyway, when that returns, assuming that is true, which it should if everything is set up properly, then you can just check game mode player 1, and if you're not familiar with this series, I'll show you what it looks like. I just have references, pointers, to both player 1 and player 2. Let me set this here. Okay. And then it's basically saying if player 1 is equal to this, so this is this specific object instance. So if this class that is running this functionality is the same thing as player 1, then we're player 1. So we're going to bind our controls based on the player 1 controls. Else, bind our controls based on the player 2 controls. There you go. And that shouldn't be anything too bad. Again, you don't even have to do this if you want to just have all the same controls, or if you want to have them on 1 input device and just make sure the controls are different when you put them in. That's fine. This is kind of a better way to do it in my opinion, just because they can still be bound to whatever the players set themselves, but then it allows you to kind of have more control over it because they can use multiple devices or a single device and it will work for both cases. Everything else I believe should stay the same. I did go over these last episode, but I'll touch on them again. I did make P2 attacks and movements and jumps for all of these, for all of player 2. Now, these functions are specifically for keyboard functions, for 2 people using the same input device. And I'll show you why that is, again, when we get into the character. But the short version of it is, we want to be able to call functions in Blueprint that player 2 can use on the same input device, and we don't use functions like start attack 1 and all this stuff that are Blueprint callable normally. So that's to kind of differentiate those attacks, and then also kind of make things a bit more modular. Okay. That was basically all of the code. But you are going to have to make another class, and we're going to make a player controller class. So you can click on your C++ classes here in the content browser. Click this little button if you don't see this. And then you can either add new right here, a new C++ class, or just add new from the Blueprint section and scroll down to the bottom. Scroll down until you reach player controller. Hit next, name it whatever you want, create the class. You'll have a new class. I called mine base player controller. You'll see I put nothing in it. You don't need any sort of functionality in here right now. Eventually, especially when we do online multiplayer, we will be moving the control setup that we were just going over to the player controller. That is technically a better spot for it, but it's not necessary right now, so we're going to ignore that. So just make sure you have this class, because the important part is that it inherits off of player controller. Alright, now, in the editor, go back to this. Let's go to our default game mode BP, and I'm also going to need the mutant character open. I'm going to do that now. So you're going to need to do this with all your characters most likely, but okay. In your default game mode BP, if you've been following the series, we determine the character class that we are. I have 2 right now, mannequin and mutant. We spawn the players, and then we possess them. Move this back over. Okay? Well, we weren't creating a player controller before. Now, that's fine. The character can handle all that without creating any sort of player controller. The issue is when you're trying to... So, only one controller, or a controller can only possess one thing at a time. You can kind of juggle multiple items and control them, but it can only actually possess one thing at a time. You have to unpossess it and then possess something else if you want to take control of something else with just the controller. So, a controller is automatically created, or pseudo-created, I want to say, because it's not a full controller. But whenever you have an input device, Unreal actually picks up on that and gives you a controller for it. So we have our keyboard. That's why we can use this get player controller 0. This essentially is saying, okay, player controller 0, the one input device we have, is our player controller. Well, that's an issue for controlling 2 pawns, thus the reason we had to kind of do some workarounds last episode for player 2, also on the keyboard, because we're not possessing that other pawn. We can try to all we want, but it just flat out won't work. That's the reason we made this new player controller class. So, if you go into spawn players, this is player 2, okay? And remember, player 1 and player 2 were the same before, but we weren't actually possessing player 2. This is where this comes into play. So we're going to spawn actor. So literally spawn actor from class. You're going to spawn your new base player controller. You can also make this a blueprint class if you want. I should have said that earlier, but it doesn't matter, just as long as you're inheriting from player controller. Okay, and then once you've done that, make sure you spawn it. Use the spawn transform we were already using, that we're throwing into determine character class. And then go ahead, and you'll see I'm dragging it out. We still set player 2. Everything's normal. But then we called possess, and we're actually going through it this time. This was always not plugged in before. Now we're going to plug it in. We're going to possess the pawn. We're going to possess player 2. You can see this is actually player 2. I could just bring it from here, but whatever. We're going to possess player 2 using the player controller. And now that we've done that, our controls are set up to be different than player 1. That's what we did in code and what we did in the project settings. And now we have 2 different player controllers. Now, if we have 2 input devices, if we have 2 controllers, you will not need to create another player controller. Again, it's like pseudo done for you by Unreal. So you wouldn't actually need to spawn this class. There's ways around that. Right now, we're not going to really touch on that because it's not necessary to get rid of the other player controller. It's just you don't necessarily have to manually spawn it. Just like we're not manually spawning player 1. You could. It actually, I don't believe it would hurt anything. I haven't tried it because, again, it's not necessary. However, theoretically, and what Unreal is intended to do, is when you possess a player, with giving it the player controller index. So if I give it 0 or 1 or whatever, it will automatically take over the pseudo created player controller. So theoretically, you could do this with spawning a base player controller for both, and you'd be fine. I'm not going to touch on that for now or try it right now because I have an idea in mind of where I want to kind of implement that functionality. It's also going to be important for online multiplayer when we get to that. So there is going to be a bit of rework when we do that, and that's okay. But you have to understand how to do it offline first. So I just wanted to make that a point and kind of explain why this was happening. But just make sure you spawn another player controller and possess it. That's the simplest way to explain this. Now, in your character, again, and last time I'll mention it, but again, we did this in the last episode in part 1. So feel free to reference that if you need to. In here, everything can stay the same. I did add is valid checks to all these. It gets repetitive, but it is honestly what we should do, so I've been trying to be good with it. And I can delete this now because that was from last episode. Okay. So, actually, I'll keep that in there because I might use that for testing later. Anyway, so last time we had all these where we have our input actions and our input axis. However, we could not move using our input axis, and we could not jump using it last time. The reason that was the case is actually because these things were not set up through the player controller. So the player controller, the jump button and the move right are actually from a character, essentially. And they both require player controllers to do that. Since we only had one, we could do the attacks on player 2, no problem, because we're giving it the character reference. But since we didn't have a player controller, we couldn't do any of the functions that Unreal made to make our character move or jump without a separate player controller. So, I added isValid checks. You don't have to do that. I'd highly recommend it. It's very good to do, very good practice, as annoying as it is to put in all these places. For your input actions, and you just right-click and access input action. And then you have all your input actions right here. This gets called when you press this button. So when player 2 presses any of these buttons, we call the blueprint callable functions I mentioned earlier in code. It's these guys right here. All these player 2 keyboard attacks. Alright. So once you do that, once you've essentially spawned your second player controller, set up all your inputs for your player 2, and again, I don't need this, but I might use it for testing later, so it's okay. Then you should be good to go. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that would be worth saying, but I think that's everything. Just make sure, especially after you make the new file, that you build the solution or rebuild it, and then compile the engine. Once you're done with that, and you've added it to all the characters that you want to be able to move, go ahead and test it out. You should now have control over a second player. You can say I can control them both at the same time or separate. I should be able to do all the same functionality. And you can see I can do combo with player 1, combo with player 2. I can use all my different attacks. Yeah, both walk, both jump, all that. So there you go, guys. We can do all the same logic with player 1 with player 2 now. So now we have two different characters that we can use with one input device, or two if you have two controllers. Just make sure you have the inputs set up that they'll work with the controller input, because you'd have to put in their actual buttons. And there you go. Now you have two playable characters, and that'll make this next part a lot easier when we get on making the camera boundaries, because that way we can test with two characters instead of one. Alright guys, so that's all I got for this episode. Hopefully that helps you out. We'll be doing online multiplayer in a bit. We still have quite a bit to do before we get to that level. But, anyway guys, I'm Shawnthebro. If this video helps you, the most important thing you can do to support this channel is just subscribe. It just helps me know what you're interested in seeing and what you want me to make more of. If you need any assistance, you can join the Discord. The link is in the description. It won't let me put it as an iCard because YouTube's weird like that. But there's 80-some members, and we can actually, there's a bunch of different people with a bunch of different skill sets in there. So we'd be more than happy to help you out with any issues you had during this tutorial. And you can ask specific questions or recommend ideas or videos that you'd like to be seen in there. So it's a great, wonderful community. Even if I am a little bit biased because I love it. But anyway, lastly, if you would like to come see me do anything other than just talk about programming stuff, we have a Twitch channel called Shawnthebro27 because someone took my name, long story. Anyway, if you want to check us out on that, I'd really appreciate it. We do Dark Souls Wednesday, Resident Evil Friday, and Saturday's usually just random multiplayer games that we have fun with. So anyway, guys, I'm Shawnthebro. Thanks for watching this video, and I will see you next Friday. Bye, my friends.